The autumn rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of the Asheville Heritage Restoration Center, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the painstaking work being conducted inside. Margaret Chen carefully adjusted the magnifying lamp over the photograph lying on her workstation, its surface covered with more than a century of accumulated grime and oxidation. The year was 2023, and Margaret had spent the last 15 years of her career breathing new life into forgotten images from America's past. This particular photograph had arrived 3 weeks earlier in a cardboard box filled with estate sale purchases. The donor, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hawkins, had inherited a collection of family artifacts from her great-aunt's estate in the mountains of western North Carolina. Among the yellowed letters, brittle newspaper clippings, and faded documents was this large funeral portrait, measuring 16 by 20 inches, mounted in an ornate Victorian frame whose gilt had long since tarnished to a dull bronze. Margaret had seen countless funeral portraits throughout her career. The practice of photographing the deceased had been common in the late 19th century, particularly in rural areas where families wanted one final image of their loved ones. These memento mori photographs served as both memorial and proof of a life lived, carefully staged with flowers, religious symbols, and grieving family members arranged around the coffin. The photograph before her showed exactly such a scene. A wooden coffin dominated the center of the frame, positioned in what appeared to be a modest parlor. The walls were bare save for a simple cross, and rough-hewn wooden floors stretched beneath the funeral arrangement. Around the coffin stood 7 people, their faces bearing the solemn expressions typical of the era's long exposure times. The adults wore their finest dark clothing, threadbare but clean, while 2 children in the front clutched small bouquets of mountain laurel. What made this photograph particularly striking was its remarkable preservation beneath the surface damage. The composition was expertly done, the lighting dramatic and purposeful. Someone with considerable skill had created this image, unusual for such a remote location. Margaret had already spent 2 weeks carefully cleaning the photograph using specialized solvents and techniques, gradually revealing details that had been hidden for decades. Her colleague, James Morrison, approached her workstation carrying 2 cups of coffee. James was in his early 30s, nearly 20 years younger than Margaret, but his enthusiasm for historical preservation matched her own. He had joined the center straight out of graduate school, drawn by the opportunity to work with authentic artifacts rather than digital reproductions. "How's the Hawkins photograph coming along?" James asked, setting 1 cup beside her work area. The steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee through the laboratory. Margaret sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. She had been working under the magnifying lamp for 3 hours straight, and the strain was beginning to show. "It's beautiful work, James." Whoever took this photograph knew exactly what they were doing. The lighting, the composition, the way the subjects are arranged. This wasn't just some traveling photographer passing through. This was someone with real talent. James leaned closer, studying the image with interest. The photograph had been taken outdoors despite the parlor staging, evidenced by the natural light streaming from the left side of the frame. The photographer had positioned the subjects to take advantage of the mountain sunlight filtering through what must have been a dense canopy of trees. Shadows fell naturally across the scene, creating depth and dimension rarely seen in amateur photography of that era. "Have you been able to identify any of the people?" James asked, pointing to the figures arranged around the coffin. Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Mrs. Hawkins said the photograph came from her great-aunt Lillian's collection. Lillian was born in 1920, so she wouldn't have been alive when this was taken. The notation on the back simply says, "Coleridge family, September 1893, Sourwood Creek." I've been trying to cross-reference that with census records and local historical societies, but Sourwood Creek was incredibly remote. Many of those mountain communities kept poor records, if they kept any at all. She picked up a cotton swab and carefully worked at a stubborn patch of oxidation near the bottom right corner of the photograph. The chemical solution she had applied was beginning to break down the accumulated damage, revealing more of the original image beneath. Margaret worked with infinite patience, knowing that one careless moment could destroy information that had survived for 130 years. "There's something odd about this, though," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "I've been noticing some inconsistencies as I clean the image. See how the family members are positioned? Their body language suggests they're looking at the coffin, but their eyes don't quite line up with where the coffin actually is in the frame. It's subtle, but once you notice it, it becomes obvious." James studied the photograph more closely, tilting his head to examine the angles. Margaret was right. The woman standing at what would be the head of the coffin appeared to be gazing at a point several inches above where the coffin's occupant would be. The man beside her, presumably her husband based on their proximity and matching mourning attire, had his attention focused somewhere beyond the frame entirely. Maybe the photographer gave them directions to look at specific points. James suggested. Extended exposure times meant subjects had to hold still for several seconds. Looking at fixed points would help them maintain position. Possibly, Margaret agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. But that doesn't explain this. She moved the magnifying lamp to focus on the coffin itself. Over the past few days of careful cleaning, she had been uncovering increasingly fine details of the photograph's composition. The wood grain of the coffin was visible, along with the simple brass handles attached to its sides. But as the oxidation cleared away, something peculiar was emerging. "Look at the shadows," Margaret said, using a clean swab to point out specific areas without touching the photograph surface. "The light source is coming from the left, which creates shadows falling to the right. See how the shadow falls from this man's hat? And from the woman's dress? They're all consistent with the light direction." James nodded, following her explanation. "Now look at the coffin's shadow," Margaret continued. "It should be casting a substantial shadow to the right, but it's barely there. And more importantly, look at the interior of the coffin itself. With the light coming from this angle, we should be seeing some illumination of whatever is inside. Instead, it's completely dark, almost as if..." She stopped mid-sentence, her expression suddenly changing. Margaret reached for her laptop and pulled up the high-resolution scans she had been making of the photograph throughout the restoration process. She opened an image editing program and began manipulating the contrast and brightness of specific areas of the scan. "What is it?" James asked, sensing her growing excitement. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she adjusted various parameters, enhancing different portions of the image. The modern software could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, separating different layers of photographic information that had been captured by the original camera's chemical process. Finally, she sat back, her expression a mixture of confusion and fascination. "James, I don't think there's a body in that coffin." James laughed uncertainly. "What do you mean?" "It's a funeral portrait." "I know what it's supposed to be," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of her claim. "But look at this. I've been gradually enhancing the shadow detail inside the coffin. If there was a body present, even allowing for the dark mourning clothes typical of the period, we should be seeing some variation in the shadows. Some indication of fabric folds, facial features in profile, hands folded across the chest, something." She pulled up another window on her screen, showing a reference photograph from the center's extensive collection. "This is a typical funeral portrait from 1889, taken in Tennessee. Similar lighting conditions, similar composition. See how you can make out the deceased's features even in the shadows? The nose creates a highlight here, the jawline is visible here, and you can see the texture of the burial clothes." She switched back to the Coleridge photograph. "Now look at this. It's absolutely uniform darkness. Not the darkness of black fabric or shadowed features, but the darkness of empty space." James stared at the screen, his earlier skepticism fading as he absorbed what Margaret was showing him. She was right. The more he looked at the enhanced images, the more obvious the absence became. The coffin appeared to be completely empty. Could it be a post-mortem photograph taken before the body was placed in the coffin? James suggested, grasping for a rational explanation. "Then why stage it as a funeral scene at all?" Margaret countered. "And why are all these people dressed in mourning clothes, holding flowers, arranged around an empty coffin? It doesn't make sense." She turned back to the physical photograph on her workstation, studying it with renewed intensity. Every detail suddenly seemed significant, possibly holding clues to the mystery. The faces of the 7 people, frozen in time, revealed nothing of their thoughts. Their expressions were appropriately solemn, their postures respectful and grief-stricken. Yet they stood vigil over an empty coffin. "There's got to be an explanation," James said. People in 1893 didn't create elaborate funeral photographs as jokes, especially not in remote Appalachian communities where photography was expensive and rare. Margaret agreed. She had spent years studying the cultural practices and social customs of 19th century America, particularly in rural regions. Funeral photography had been a serious business, treated with reverence and care. Families saved for months to afford such photographs, which often became treasured heirlooms passed down through generations. The implications were troubling. Either they were misinterpreting what they were seeing, or something very unusual had happened in Sourwood Creek in September of 1893. "We need to find out more about these people," Margaret decided. Mrs. Hawkins said this came from her great-aunt Lillian's estate. "Let me contact her and see if there are any family stories associated with this photograph. In the meantime, can you start digging through the historical records? Census data, local newspapers, church registries, anything that might mention the Coleridge family or Sourwood Creek during that period." James nodded eagerly. The mystery had captured his imagination as completely as it had Margaret's. "I'll start with the 1890 census. If we can identify the family members, we might be able to trace what happened to them." "Be prepared for gaps in the records," Margaret warned. Mountain communities often operated outside formal record-keeping systems. Births, deaths, marriages, many went unrecorded except in family Bibles and personal documents. As James returned to his own workstation to begin the research, Margaret continued her careful restoration work. But her mind was no longer focused solely on the technical aspects of preservation. Questions multiplied with each passing minute. Who are these 7 people? Whose funeral were they attending? And most importantly, why was the coffin empty? The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows as afternoon faded toward evening. Margaret worked methodically, documenting every stage of the restoration process with photographs and detailed notes. Professional discipline demanded thoroughness regardless of the mystery surrounding the subject. By 6 o'clock, she had completed the basic cleaning of the photograph. The image that emerged was remarkable in its clarity and composition, a testament to both the photographer's skill and the quality of the materials used. The faces of the Coleridge family were now visible in sharp detail, their features no longer obscured by decades of accumulated damage. Margaret photographed each person individually, creating close-up images that would help with identification. The woman at the head of the coffin appeared to be in her late 30s or early 40s, her face gaunt and worn by hardship but retaining traces of earlier beauty. The man beside her was older, perhaps 50, with a thick beard going gray at the edges. His hands, visible where they rested at his sides, were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime in manual labor. The other adults were harder to place. 2 younger women, possibly sisters based on their similar features, stood on the right side of the coffin. A young man, barely out of his teens, stood behind them with his hand resting protectively on one woman's shoulder. Another older man, his face weathered and scarred, stood slightly apart from the main group, as if uncertain of his place in the gathering. The 2 children in front were perhaps 8 and 10 years old, both girls wearing simple dresses that had been carefully mended multiple times. They clutched their bouquets of mountain laurel with the same somber intensity as the adults displayed in their expressions. 7 people, arranged around an empty coffin, in a photograph taken 130 years ago in a remote mountain hollow that might not even exist anymore. Margaret felt the weight of their gazes across the decades, these people who had stood still for the camera's lengthy exposure, preserving a moment whose meaning had been lost to time. Her phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Found something interesting. 1890 census shows a Jacob Coleridge family in Yancey County. Matches the approximate location of Sourwood Creek. We'll send details." Margaret smiled. The investigation was beginning in earnest. She carefully covered the restored photograph with acid-free tissue paper and secured it in a climate-controlled storage cabinet. Tomorrow she would continue with the final stages of restoration, but tonight she wanted to focus on research. Before leaving, she took one last look at the digital image on her laptop screen. The empty coffin seemed to mock her from across the years, guarding its secret. Whatever had happened in Sourwood Creek in September 1893, someone had considered it important enough to document with this elaborate photograph. Margaret was determined to discover why. The rain had intensified by the time she locked the laboratory and headed to her car. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing off the surrounding mountains. As she drove through Asheville streets toward her apartment, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something larger than a simple restoration project. The photograph held answers to questions that nobody had thought to ask for over a century. Somewhere in the archives, in dusty records and fading documents, the truth about the empty coffin was waiting to be discovered. Margaret had dedicated her career to recovering lost stories from America's past. Now she had stumbled onto one of the most intriguing mysteries she had ever encountered. The story of the Coleridge family was about to emerge from the shadows of history, and Margaret suspected it would prove to be unlike anything she had imagined. Margaret arrived at the Restoration Center early the next morning, her mind still churning with questions about the mysterious photograph. She had spent most of the previous night researching Appalachian funeral customs and photographic practices of the 1890s, searching for any precedent that might explain an empty coffin in a formal memorial portrait. She had found nothing. The storm from the previous evening had passed, leaving behind a crisp autumn morning with crystalline air that made the surrounding mountains stand out in sharp relief against the pale blue sky. Margaret barely noticed the beauty as she hurried into the building, eager to continue the investigation. James was already at his workstation, surrounded by printouts and open books. He looked up as Margaret approached, his expression animated with the excitement of discovery. "I've been here since 6, he announced without preamble. "Margaret, this case is fascinating. I found census records, land deeds, and even a few newspaper articles. The story gets stranger the deeper I dig." Margaret pulled up a chair beside him, setting down her coffee and notepad. "Tell me everything." James organized his papers, creating a makeshift timeline on the desk. "Okay, so I started with the 1890 census for Yancey County. I found a Jacob Coleridge listed as head of household, age 48, occupation listed as farmer. His wife Sarah was 37. They had 5 children. Rebecca, age 19, Samuel, age 17, Margaret, interesting coincidence there, age 14, Elizabeth, age 10, and Ruth, age 8. That's 7 people, Margaret noted. The same number in the photograph. Exactly. The ages match what we're seeing in the image, allowing for 3 years between the census and the photograph. But here's where it gets interesting. James pulled out a photocopy of a handwritten document. This is from the Yancey County land records. In 1885, Jacob Coleridge purchased 47 acres in a location described as along Sourwood Creek, in the high hollows of the Eastern Range. The deed was witnessed by a Reverend Thomas Mitchell and recorded at the county courthouse. So they were definitely in the right location, Margaret confirmed. Yes, but look at this. James produced another document, this one a newspaper clipping from the Asheville Citizen dated October 12, 1893. The paper was brittle and yellowed, but the text was still legible. Margaret read the headline with growing astonishment, "Mysterious Disappearance in Mountain Community." The article was brief, occupying only a few column inches on an inside page, but its contents were remarkable. Reports have reached this city of a strange occurrence in the remote settlement near Sourwood Creek. According to travelers passing through the region, a young woman of the Coleridge family has vanished under mysterious circumstances. Local residents report that Sarah Coleridge, wife of farmer Jacob Coleridge, disappeared from her home on the evening of September 15th. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding forest, no trace of Mrs. Coleridge has been found. The family has reportedly held funeral services, though no body has been recovered. County authorities have been notified but have not yet ventured to the isolated location to investigate. The terrain in that region is notoriously difficult, and the approach of winter weather may prevent official inquiry until spring. Margaret reread the article 3 times, her mind racing. The photograph is dated September 1893. This article is from October of the same year. The timing matches perfectly. And notice what the article says, James added, tapping the relevant passage. They held funeral services without a body. Margaret, what if that photograph documents those very services? A funeral for someone who disappeared, conducted with an empty coffin because there was no body to bury. It made a terrible kind of sense. Margaret thought about the faces in the photograph, their expressions of grief now taking on new meaning. These weren't people mourning a conventional death. They were people dealing with loss without closure, absence without explanation, grief without the comfort of certain knowledge. What happened to the family after that? Margaret asked. Did Sarah Coleridge ever return? Was her body found later? James shook his head. That's what I've been trying to figure out. I found a few more references in subsequent years. Here's another article from April 1894. He handed Margaret another clipping, this one even briefer than the first. The mysterious case of Sarah Coleridge, reported missing from her home near Sourwood Creek last autumn, remains unsolved. Spring travelers to the region report that the family continues to maintain their farm, though neighbors describe them as withdrawn and reluctant to discuss the matter. No new evidence regarding Mrs. Coleridge's fate has emerged. Nothing after that? Margaret asked. Not about Sarah specifically, but I did find something else. James pulled out a printed page from a genealogy website. I've been cross-referencing family records. The Coleridge children all eventually left the mountain. Rebecca married in 1896 and moved to Tennessee. Samuel went west in 1898, possibly to work in the mines. The younger daughters were taken in by relatives in different locations after their father died in 1902. Jacob died only 9 years after the photograph was taken, Margaret noted. He would have been in his early 50s. Do the records say how he died? Natural causes, according to the county death register. But natural causes in rural areas during that period could mean almost anything. He's buried in a small cemetery near Sourwood Creek, alongside his parents and siblings. Sarah doesn't have a marker there. Margaret studied the photograph again on her laptop screen, seeing it now with the context James had provided. These were real people dealing with an incomprehensible tragedy. A wife and mother had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a family that would never fully recover from the loss. We need to find out more about the photographer, Margaret said. Someone with significant skill took this image. Professional photographers in rural areas during that period were rare, and they often kept business records. If we can identify who took the photograph, we might find more information about the circumstances surrounding it. I thought about that, James replied. The problem is that traveling photographers rarely kept permanent records, and those that did stored them haphazardly. Most of those archives have been lost or scattered over the decades. Still, it's worth investigating. The quality of this work suggests someone with training and proper equipment. That narrows the field considerably. Margaret made notes on her pad. I'm also going to contact Mrs. Hawkins again and see if she can provide more details about how her great-aunt Lillian came to possess this photograph. There has to be a family connection we're missing. As the morning progressed, Margaret continued the final stages of the photograph's restoration while James delved deeper into historical records. The work was painstaking and methodical, requiring intense concentration and a steady hand. Margaret found the technical process soothing, a counterpoint to the disturbing questions raised by the photograph's content. Around 11 o'clock, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Dorothy Hawkins's number. Mrs. Hawkins, thank you for returning my call, Margaret answered. The elderly woman's voice came through clearly despite her age. Of course, dear. You said you had questions about that old photograph? I'm happy to help however I can, though I'm afraid I don't know much about it. I'm trying to understand the connection between your great-aunt Lillian and the Coleridge family, Margaret explained. The photograph appears to show a funeral scene from 1893, but we've discovered some unusual circumstances surrounding it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Hawkins spoke again, Her voice carried a note of surprise. Funeral scene? I never looked at it that closely, to be honest. It was just one of many old photographs in Aunt Lillian's collection. She had boxes and boxes of them, accumulated over her lifetime. Did your aunt ever mention the Coleridge family? Or a place called Sourwood Creek? Another pause, longer this time. Margaret could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. Sourwood Creek? Yes, I believe Aunt Lillian was born somewhere near there. Her maiden name was Mitchell before she married. Thomas Mitchell was her grandfather, if I remember correctly. He was a minister in those mountains. Margaret's pulse quickened. Thomas Mitchell had been one of the witnesses on Jacob Coleridge's land deed. The connection was becoming clearer. Mrs. Hawkins, do you have any of your aunt's papers? Letters, journals, anything that might mention the Coleridge family or events from that period? Oh my, there are boxes of papers. I haven't gone through most of them. They're all in storage at my daughter's house. I could ask her to look through them if you think it would help. That would be incredibly valuable, Margaret said. We're trying to piece together what happened to a woman named Sarah Coleridge who disappeared in September 1893. Any information your aunt might have recorded would be extremely helpful. Disappeared? How terrible. Mrs. Hawkins's voice softened with sympathy. I'll call my daughter right away. She lives in Charlotte, so it might take a few days to go through everything, but I'll make sure she knows it's important. After ending the call, Margaret shared the news with James. The connection between Lillian Mitchell and Reverend Thomas Mitchell provided a direct link between the photograph's current owner and the historical events they were investigating. If Reverend Mitchell was involved in the community during that period, he might have been the one who conducted Sarah's funeral service, James speculated. Ministers often kept detailed records of baptisms, marriages, and funerals. If we could find his church records, that's assuming the church still exists or that its records were preserved, Margaret interrupted, though not unkindly. Small mountain churches from that era often didn't survive. Buildings burned down, congregations dispersed, records were lost or discarded. True, but it's worth trying to locate them. I'll contact the regional historical societies and see if anyone has information about churches in the Sourwood Creek area during the 1890s. Margaret returned her attention to the physical photograph, which was now ready for the final preservation steps. She would encapsulate it in an archival mounting system that would protect it from further deterioration while allowing it to be displayed and studied. But before she did so, she wanted to examine every detail one more time. She positioned the magnifying lamp over different sections of the image, studying aspects she hadn't focused on during the initial cleaning. The background of the photograph revealed more about the setting than she had initially noticed. The rough wooden walls suggested a simple dwelling, but certain details spoke of care and pride. A sampler with embroidered text hung on one wall, though the words were too small to read even under magnification. A shelf visible in the background held several books, unusual for a rural household of that period, suggesting a family that valued education. Most interesting was what appeared to be a rifle leaning against the far wall. Margaret enhanced that section of the digital image, bringing the detail into sharper focus. The rifle was a distinctive model, probably a Winchester or similar lever-action design popular in that era. Its presence wasn't unusual, most rural families relied on hunting for food, but its positioning seemed deliberate, as if the photographer had specifically wanted it included in the frame. James, come look at this, Margaret called out. He joined her at the workstation, following her pointing finger to the enhanced image on the screen. What do you make of the rifle? She asked. James studied it carefully. It's positioned prominently, almost like it's part of the composition. Like the photographer wanted to include it. Exactly. Everything else in the frame serves a purpose in the narrative. The coffin, the mourners, the flowers. The rifle feels intentional too, but I can't figure out why. They both stared at the image, trying to decode its significance. Was it simply a detail of daily life that happened to be captured, or did it carry symbolic meaning for the people in the photograph? The rest of the day passed in focused work and research. James made contact with 3 different historical societies in western North Carolina, all of whom promised to search their archives for information about Reverend Thomas Mitchell and churches near Sourwood Creek. Margaret completed the final preservation mounting of the photograph, ensuring it would survive for future generations to study. By early evening, they had assembled a clearer picture of the Coleridge family situation, though many questions remained unanswered. Sarah Coleridge had disappeared on September 15, 1893, under circumstances unclear from the surviving records. Her family had held a funeral service despite having no body to bury. Someone, possibly Reverend Thomas Mitchell, had arranged for a skilled photographer to document the service. The resulting image had been preserved by Mitchell's granddaughter and eventually passed down to Dorothy Hawkins, but the central mystery remained unsolved. What had actually happened to Sarah Coleridge? Had she died in an accident whose circumstances prevented recovery of her body? Had she been the victim of violence? Or had she left voluntarily, abandoning her family for reasons known only to herself? Margaret was packing up for the evening when her email pinged with a new message. It was from the Appalachian Heritage Society in Burnsville, and the subject line made her heart race. Information about Reverend Thomas Mitchell and Sourwood Creek Church. She opened the email immediately and read, "Dear Miss Chin, thank you for your inquiry about Reverend Thomas Mitchell. We do have some information about him in our archives. Mitchell served several small congregations in the mountain communities of Yancey County from approximately 1880 until his death in 1910. He was known for his dedication to serving isolated communities that larger churches ignored. More relevant to your inquiry, we have a collection of his personal papers donated by his descendants in 1956. This collection includes several journals in which he recorded notable events in the communities he served. I took the liberty of searching for references to the Coleridge family and found several entries that may interest you. The most significant entry is dated September 20, 1893. Rather than summarize it, I'm attaching photographs of the relevant pages. Mitchell's handwriting is quite legible, and I believe you'll find his account illuminating. Please feel free to visit our archives if you need access to additional materials. Sincerely, Patricia Coleman, Archives Director." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the attached images. The first showed a journal page covered in neat, precise handwriting. She began to read, and as she did, the events of September 1893 began to come into focus. September 20th, 1893. I am still shaken by the events of the past several days and feel compelled to record them, though the memory brings me great distress. On the evening of September 15th, I was summoned to the Coleridge home with urgent word that something terrible had occurred. Margaret read the rest of the entry in growing astonishment, then immediately called James back to the laboratory. The mystery of the empty coffin was beginning to reveal itself, and the truth was both tragic and profoundly human. The afternoon sun hung low over Sourwood Creek on September 15, 1893, casting long shadows across the clearing where the Coleridge family had built their home 8 years earlier. Sarah Coleridge stood at her kitchen window, watching her youngest daughters, Elizabeth and Ruth, chase chickens around the yard. Their laughter carried through the open window, a sound that normally brought her comfort but today seemed to underscore the weight pressing on her chest. She was dying. Sarah had known it for certain since late July, though she had suspected for months before that. The pain in her abdomen had grown steadily worse, spreading like dark roots through her body. She had hidden it from her family as long as possible, but the weight loss and increasing fatigue were becoming impossible to conceal. Jacob had noticed, of course. Her husband missed very little, though he seemed reluctant to voice his concerns, as if speaking them aloud would make them real. The previous week, Sarah had finally made the difficult journey down the mountain to see Dr. Brennan in Burnsville. The trip had taken 2 days by wagon, and every jolt along the rough trail had sent sharp pains through her middle. Dr. Brennan had examined her with gentle professionalism, but she had seen the truth in his eyes before he spoke a single word. "It's a growth, Mrs. Coleridge," he had told her quietly, his weathered hands folded on his desk. "In your womb, possibly spreading to the surrounding organs. I've seen this condition before, and I must be honest with you about the outcome." Sarah had asked him not to elaborate. She didn't need medical terminology to understand what was coming. She had seen enough death in the mountains to recognize its approach. "How long?" she had asked simply. Dr. Brennan had hesitated. "That's difficult to say with certainty. Months, perhaps. Maybe less. The pain will increase, and eventually, He had trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Now, standing in her kitchen with the sun slanting through the window, Sarah contemplated the impossible task ahead of her. She was 37 years old with 5 children who still needed their mother. Rebecca, at 19, was capable and strong, but she shouldn't have to carry the burden of motherhood for her siblings. Samuel was only 17, still figuring out his place in the world. The younger girls were just children, and Jacob. Her husband had already endured so much hardship in his life. Losing his first wife to childbirth, struggling to establish their farm on this difficult land, working from dawn to dusk just to keep food on the table. Now he would lose her too, and she knew it would break something fundamental in him. Sarah had spent the past week since her return from Burnsville thinking about what she could do to ease the coming transition for her family. She had written letters to each child, to be given to them after her death. She had recorded her recipes and household knowledge in a notebook for Rebecca. She had mended every piece of clothing in the house and prepared as much preserved food as her waning strength allowed, but she knew it wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough to prepare them for her absence. The sound of a horse approaching drew Sarah's attention. Through the window, she saw Reverend Thomas Mitchell dismounting in the yard. The minister was a regular visitor to the scattered families along Sourwood Creek, making his rounds on horseback regardless of weather or season. Sarah had sent word to him earlier in the week, asking if he might call when convenient. She walked slowly to the door, moving carefully to avoid triggering the sharp pains that now accompanied any sudden movement. Reverend Mitchell saw her and waved, his kind face breaking into a warm smile that faded as he got closer and saw her condition clearly. "Mrs. Coleridge," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I received your message. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time?" "Not at all, Reverend. I'm grateful you could come." Sarah gestured toward the house. "Would you join me for tea? Jacob is working in the upper field, and the children are occupied. We can speak privately." They settled at the kitchen table, and Sarah poured tea from the kettle she kept perpetually warm on the stove. The simple ritual of hospitality provided a buffer against the difficult conversation ahead. "Reverend, I'll speak plainly," Sarah began once they were both seated. "I'm dying. Dr. Brennan in Burnsville confirmed it. I have perhaps a few months, possibly less." To his credit, Reverend Mitchell didn't offer empty reassurances or platitudes about God's mysterious ways. He simply nodded, his expression somber. "I suspected as much from your message. I'm deeply sorry, Sarah. You're far too young for such a fate." "Age doesn't seem to factor into God's calculations," Sarah said without bitterness. "But I've made my peace with it, or as much peace as is possible. What concerns me now is my family. Specifically, I need your help with something unusual." She reached across the table and took the minister's weathered hand in her own. "When I die, when my body gives out, I don't want my children to see me like that. I've watched too many mountain families force their children to view bodies prepared for burial, to kiss cold foreheads and look at faces that aren't really their loved ones anymore. I don't want that for Elizabeth and Ruth. They're so young, and I want their last memories of me to be of their living mother, not a corpse dressed in burial clothes." Reverend Mitchell listened carefully, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah continued. "What if we held the funeral service before I die? While I'm still myself, still able to help prepare for it. We could stage everything as it would be after my passing. The mourning clothes, the flowers, the coffin. We could even have a photographer document it, the way families do for real funerals. But the coffin would be empty, and I would be there to see my family say their goodbyes while I can still hear them and understand what they're saying." She could see the shock on Reverend Mitchell's face, quickly followed by deep thought. He was silent for a long moment, considering the theological and practical implications of what she was proposing. "I've never heard of such a thing," he finally said slowly. "But I can't say there's anything morally wrong with it. If anything, it's perhaps more honest than the usual practice. We speak to the dead as if they can hear us, but we have no way of knowing if that's true. What you're proposing would let you truly hear your family's farewells while you're still present to receive them." "I know it's strange," Sarah acknowledged, "but I've thought of little else these past days. I want to spare my children the sight of my body after death, but I also want them to have closure. This seems like it might accomplish both. Reverend Mitchell squeezed her hand gently. When were you thinking this would take place? Soon, Sarah said. I'm declining more rapidly than I expected. Perhaps 5 days from now? That would give me time to prepare my family and make the necessary arrangements. And Jacob? Have you discussed this with him? Sarah's eyes filled with tears for the first time. I'll speak with him tonight. He won't like it, it will feel like giving up, but I think he'll understand why it's important to me. The conversation with Jacob that evening was as difficult as Sarah had anticipated. They sat together on the porch after the children had gone to bed, watching the stars emerge one by one over the dark shapes of the mountains. Sarah explained everything, the doctor's diagnosis, her prognosis, and her unusual plan for a living funeral. Jacob listened in silence, his face carved from granite in the dim light. When she finished, he sat without speaking for several minutes. Sarah waited, knowing her husband needed time to process what she had told him. How long have you known? He finally asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Suspected? Since spring. Known for certain? Since my trip to Burnsville last week. You should have told me sooner. Would it have changed anything? Sarah asked gently. Would it have made the knowing easier? Jacob had no answer for that. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. They sat like that for a long time, drawing comfort from each other's presence and the familiar sounds of the mountain night. This plan of yours, Jacob said eventually. With the empty coffin. It's strange, Sarah. People will talk. Let them talk. I don't care about gossip. I care about our children not having nightmares about their mother's dead face. When? His voice was barely above a whisper. 5 days from now. September 20th. Reverend Mitchell will conduct the service. I want all of us dressed in mourning clothes as we would be for a real funeral. I want the photographer from Boone, the one who did the Garrison family's portrait last year. His work was beautiful. Expensive, Jacob noted. Worth it, Sarah countered. I want our family to have something tangible to remember this by. A photograph they can look at and remember the day we said goodbye while I was still myself. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah worked with a frenetic energy born of desperation and dwindling time. She sewed mourning clothes for the entire family, black dresses for herself and the girls, dark suits for Jacob and Samuel. She wrote final letters to each child and several to Jacob to be opened on future occasions, anniversaries, birthdays, moments when they might need her guidance and she wouldn't be there to provide it. The hardest conversation was with the children. Sarah gathered them all in the parlor on the evening of September 18th and explained, as gently as possible, what was happening. Rebecca, always perceptive, had already guessed much of the truth. She broke down in tears but quickly composed herself, understanding that her mother needed her to be strong. Samuel's face hardened into a mask that reminded Sarah painfully of Jacob. The younger girls clung to their mother, not fully comprehending but sensing the gravity of the moment. I need you all to do something difficult for me, Sarah told them, gathering Elizabeth and Ruth close while Rebecca and Samuel sat nearby. In 2 days, we're going to have a special service. It will look like a funeral and we'll all dress in mourning clothes, but it won't be because I've died. It will be because I want to say goodbye to each of you properly, while I can still see your faces and hear your voices. I don't want to say goodbye, Elizabeth sobbed. I want you to stay. I know, sweet girl. I want to stay too. But sometimes we don't get what we want. What we can control is how we face the things we cannot change. This service is my way of making sure that when I'm gone, you'll have a memory of me that isn't frightening or sad. You'll remember that we faced this together as a family with courage and love. On the morning of September 20th, the photographer arrived from Boone. His name was William Preston, and he came with a wagon full of equipment, cameras, glass plates, developing chemicals, and lighting apparatus. Jacob helped him set up in the yard where the light was best, positioning a simple wooden coffin that Jacob had built himself in the center of the scene. The coffin was empty, as Sarah had requested. Looking at it gave her an uncanny sensation, as if she were already dead and watching from some other plane of existence. But she pushed the feeling aside and focused on making sure everything was arranged properly. The family dressed in their morning clothes. Sarah had sewn a simple dark dress for herself, foregoing the elaborate mourning traditions of wealthier families. Rebecca and the younger girls wore similar garments, while Jacob and Samuel donned their best dark suits, worn but clean. Reverend Mitchell arrived mid-morning and took Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Are you certain you want to proceed with this?" he asked gently. "There's no shame in changing your mind." "I'm certain," Sarah replied firmly. "This is important to me. It's the last gift I can give my family, a way to remember me that doesn't involve standing over my dead body." The Reverend nodded and began preparing for the service. It would be modified from a traditional funeral, focused on celebration of life rather than mourning of death, but maintaining enough of the traditional elements to provide the closure Sarah sought. As the family gathered around the empty coffin, William Preston prepared his camera. The photography process was lengthy and complex, requiring everyone to remain perfectly still for several seconds while the image was captured on the glass plate. Preston moved around the group, adjusting positions, ensuring the light fell properly across each face. "Mrs. Coleridge, if you could stand here at the head of the coffin," Preston directed gently. "Mr. Coleridge beside you. Rebecca and Margaret on this side, Samuel behind them. Elizabeth and Ruth in front with the flowers." Sarah found herself standing where she would have stood at her own actual funeral, looking down at the empty coffin that would soon contain her body. The symbolism was not lost on her, nor on her family. She could see tears streaming down Rebecca's face, though her daughter stood tall and dignified. Jacob's hand trembled where it rested at his side. "Everyone look at me, please," Preston called out. "Try to remain as still as possible. This will take just a moment." Sarah looked toward the camera, toward the stranger who would capture this impossible moment for posterity. She wondered what people would think years from now, looking at this photograph. Would they understand what they were seeing? Would they recognize the strange courage of a woman who faced her death by arranging her own funeral while she was still alive to attend it? Preston worked methodically, taking multiple exposures to ensure he captured the scene properly. Between each shot, the family could relax briefly before being positioned again. During one of these interludes, Ruth whispered to her mother, "Mama, I'm scared." Sarah knelt down, ignoring the pain that flared through her abdomen, and pulled her youngest daughter close. "I know, my darling, but you're being so brave. We're all being brave together." After the photographs were complete, Reverend Mitchell conducted the service. It was surreal and profound, a funeral for someone who had not yet died but who stood among the mourners. The Reverend spoke about Sarah's life, her devotion to her family, her strength in the face of hardship. He invited each family member to speak if they wished. Rebecca went first, her voice breaking as she talked about lessons her mother had taught her, memories they had shared. Samuel spoke briefly but with fierce emotion about his mother's unwavering support. Even young Elizabeth managed a few words about how her mother made the best cornbread and always knew when she needed a hug. Jacob spoke last, and his words were few but weighted with decades of love. "Sarah, you've been my partner in everything for 19 years. You've made me a better man than I would have been without you. I don't know how we'll manage without you, but I promise you will try to live in a way that would make you proud." Sarah, who had remained composed throughout most of the service, finally broke down. She embraced each of her children in turn, then Jacob, memorizing the feel of their arms around her, the sound of their breathing, the smell of their hair. These physical sensations would be her lasting gifts, more precious than any photograph. As the service concluded and Preston packed up his equipment, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Jeremiah Cooper, a neighbor who lived several miles down the creek. He had heard about the unusual gathering and come to pay his respects. Sarah noticed Jacob's reaction to Cooper's arrival, a stiffening of posture, a hardening of expression. There was history between the two men, though Sarah had never fully understood its nature. Something about a land dispute years earlier, before she and Jacob had married. Cooper approached awkwardly, hat in hand. "Jacob, Mrs. Coleridge, I heard about what was happening. I wanted to come and—" He trailed off, unsure how to complete the sentence. Sarah, sensing an opportunity for healing, stepped forward. "Mr. Cooper, thank you for coming. It means more than you might think." She glanced at Jacob, who remained stiff and silent. Life is too short for old grudges to remain unresolved. Whatever happened between you and my husband years ago, I hope you'll both find a way to let it go. Cooper nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Jacob's for the first time. "I'm sorry, Jacob. For everything. I should have apologized years ago." Jacob stood frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Cooper took it, and the two men shook hands with the gravity of a peace treaty being signed. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, the gathering dispersed. Preston promised to develop the glass plate negatives and deliver prints within 2 weeks. Reverend Mitchell offered a final prayer and blessing before departing. The Coleridge family was left alone with the empty coffin and the weight of what they had just experienced. That evening, Sarah's pain intensified dramatically. She had been conserving her remaining laudanum for when the end approached, but she finally took a dose to ease the worst of the agony. As the medicine took effect and the pain receded to a manageable level, she found herself reflecting on the day with a sense of completion. She had done what she set out to do. Her children had said goodbye to her while she was still present to hear their words. They had participated in a ritual of closure that, while unconventional, might help them process her eventual death with less trauma. And they would have a photograph, a permanent record of this moment, strange though it might appear to outsiders. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that the photographer had captured an image of a funeral with an empty coffin, never realizing that the woman standing at its head was the one being mourned. Future viewers of the photograph would see 7 people arranged around an inexplicable void, never knowing that the void represented a death that was certain but had not yet occurred. Sarah lasted 3 more weeks. The pain grew steadily worse despite increasing doses of laudanum, and her strength faded day by day. Rebecca took over most of the household duties while Samuel helped Jacob with the heavier farm work. Elizabeth and Ruth spent as much time as possible with their mother, reading to her, singing songs she had taught them, simply sitting beside her bed and holding her hand. On October 7, 1893, Sarah Coleridge died peacefully in her sleep. Her family gathered around her. True to her wishes, the funeral conducted 3 weeks earlier was treated as the official ceremony. She was buried quietly in the small family cemetery on the property, with only immediate family present. Jacob never remarried. He maintained the farm until his death in 1902, at which point the property was sold and the family scattered to different locations. The children carried with them the memory of their mother's unusual strength, the woman who had faced death by arranging her own funeral so her children wouldn't have to see her corpse, and somewhere in a box of family photographs, carefully preserved by Lillian Mitchell and eventually passed down through generations, the image remained. 7 people standing around an empty coffin in September 1893, their faces solemn with a grief that was both anticipatory and immediate, mourning a death that had not yet occurred but was absolutely certain to come. Margaret sat in stunned silence after reading Reverend Mitchell's journal entry. The truth about the photograph was both more heartbreaking and more beautiful than anything she had imagined. This wasn't a mystery involving crime or scandal. It was the story of a woman facing terminal illness with extraordinary courage and a mother's determination to protect her children from additional trauma. "James, you need to read this," she said quietly, forwarding the email and its attachments to her colleague. While James read through the material, Margaret returned to the physical photograph, seeing it now with completely new eyes. Every detail that had puzzled her suddenly made sense. The empty coffin wasn't evidence of something sinister. It was evidence of Sarah Coleridge's remarkable foresight and strength. The solemn expressions on the family members' faces weren't grief over a conventional death but the complex emotions of saying goodbye to someone who was still present to hear them. She examined each person's face again with this new understanding. Sarah, standing at the head of her own empty coffin, looked directly toward the camera with an expression that Margaret now recognized as determination rather than sorrow. She had been orchestrating her own funeral, controlling one of the few aspects of her death that she could control. The act took tremendous courage. Jacob's face, which Margaret had initially read as simple grief, now showed something more complex, a mixture of loss, pride, and the burden of knowledge. He was watching his wife say goodbye to their children while simultaneously preparing to fulfill his promise to honor her memory through the difficult years ahead. Rebecca, the eldest daughter at 19, stood with the bearing of someone being forced into premature adulthood. She had understood, perhaps more clearly than her younger siblings, what the ceremony represented. The weight of impending responsibility showed in her posture and expression. Young Samuel, at 17, displayed the rigid self-control of a boy trying to be a man. His hand on his sister's shoulder wasn't just positioned for the photograph. It was an unconscious gesture of protection and solidarity. The younger girls, Elizabeth and Ruth, clutched their mountain laurel bouquets with the intensity of children who sensed something momentous was occurring but couldn't fully grasp its meaning. Their faces showed confusion mixed with fear and sadness. "This is incredible," James said, finally looking up from his computer screen. "Margaret, this isn't just a historical curiosity. This is a profound human document." Sarah Coleridge essentially created her own living memorial. More than that, Margaret added. She pioneered a form of anticipatory grief processing that psychologists wouldn't formally recognize for decades. Modern hospice care sometimes includes similar practices, saying goodbyes while the patient can still participate, creating closure before death actually occurs. Sarah understood this instinctively in 1893. Margaret spent the rest of the day reading and rereading Reverend Mitchell's journal entries about the Coleridge family. The minister had maintained contact with them throughout Sarah's final weeks and had officiated at her quiet burial. His entries painted a detailed picture of a family coping with terminal illness in an era before modern medicine or psychological support systems. One entry particularly struck Margaret. Written in October 1893, after Sarah's death, Reverend Mitchell reflected, "I have been thinking much about the unusual service I conducted for Sarah Coleridge in September. At the time, I confess I had doubts about the propriety of such an unorthodox approach. But having watched the family through Sarah's final weeks and seeing how they comported themselves at her actual passing, I believe she understood something profound about grief and memory. The children were of course devastated by their mother's death, but they were not traumatized. They had already processed much of their grief through the living funeral, and Sarah's actual passing, while sorrowful, did not carry the additional burden of shock and horror. She gave her family a remarkable gift, the opportunity to say goodbye with love and intention rather than in the chaos of medical crisis and death. Perhaps there is wisdom here that the church should consider." Margaret contacted Dorothy Hawkins again to share what they had discovered. The elderly woman listened with growing amazement as Margaret explained the true story behind the mysterious photograph. "My goodness," Mrs. Hawkins said softly when Margaret finished. "Aunt Lillian never told me about this. She spoke often about her grandfather's ministry work in the mountains, but she never mentioned this particular family or the unusual funeral service." "It's possible she didn't know the full story herself," Margaret suggested. "The photograph came from your aunt's collection, which presumably came from her grandfather's effects. He may have kept it as a significant moment in his ministry without explaining all the details to his descendants. What will you do with this information?" Mrs. Hawkins asked. Margaret had been considering that question. "With your permission, I'd like to prepare a detailed report about the photograph and the story behind it. This is historically significant, not just as a curiosity, but as a documentation of how families dealt with terminal illness and anticipatory grief in the 19th century. The Coleridge family's approach was decades ahead of its time in terms of psychological understanding." "You have my full permission," Mrs. Hawkins replied. "In fact, I'd like to donate the photograph and any related materials to your restoration center or an appropriate historical society. This story deserves to be known and preserved." Over the following weeks, Margaret and James continued researching the Coleridge family's history. They tracked down descendants of the children and discovered that the photograph had become something of a family legend, though the details had become muddled over generations. Some descendants knew only that an ancestor had attended her own funeral, while others had never heard the story at all. Margaret made contact with Rebecca Coleridge's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Jennifer Hartford who lived in Knoxville. Jennifer was fascinated to learn the full story behind the family legend and shared several items that had been passed down through Rebecca's line, including one of the letters Sarah had written to her daughter before her death. The letter, written in elegant script on paper that had yellowed but remained legible, was deeply moving. "My dearest Rebecca, if you are reading this, then I have passed from this life and you are facing the enormous responsibility of caring for your father and siblings. I wish I could spare you this burden, but circumstances leave us no choice. Remember that you are stronger than you know. You have witnessed hardship and loss, yet you remain kind and good-hearted. Do not let the weight of responsibility crush the joy from your life. Your father loves you deeply, even if he struggles to express such feelings. Your brother and sisters need your guidance, but they also need to see you living fully, pursuing happiness, creating your own path forward. I have no regrets about the unusual service we conducted in September. I wanted to say goodbye to each of you while I could still see your beautiful faces and hear your voices. I wanted you to have a memory of closure that didn't involve standing over my cold body. If that choice seemed strange or difficult at the time, I hope you will understand its purpose as you grow older. Take care of them all, my darling girl. But also take care of yourself. Fall in love. Start a family. Build the life I won't be here to see. Know that wherever I am proud of the woman you have become and the woman you will continue to be. With all my love, Mother." Jennifer Hartford wiped tears from her eyes as Margaret read the letter aloud. "I never knew my great-great-grandmother was such a remarkable person. We had stories about her, of course, but they never quite captured her personality. This letter does." "Your ancestor was extraordinary," Margaret agreed. She faced terminal illness in an era with very limited medical options and almost no support for managing the psychological aspects of dying. Yet she developed her own approach to protecting her family and maintaining agency over her final weeks. That took tremendous strength. Margaret's research project expanded beyond the single photograph to encompass a broader examination of funeral practices and death rituals in Appalachian communities during the late 19th century. She discovered that while Sarah's living funeral was unusual, it wasn't entirely without precedent. Several other documented cases existed of terminally ill individuals participating in modified funeral services, though none with the careful planning and photographic documentation that characterized Sarah's ceremony. The photograph itself underwent additional analysis. Margaret brought in imaging specialists who used advanced technology to reveal even more details in the original glass plate negative that William Preston had created. They discovered that Preston had actually taken multiple exposures that day, though only one had been preserved in Lillian Mitchell's collection. The others had presumably been kept by the Coleridge family themselves and had been lost over the decades. In the enhanced images, new details emerged. The sampler visible on the wall in the background could now be read. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The books on the shelf proved to be a Bible, a hymnal, and what appeared to be a medical text. Perhaps the volume where Sarah had researched her own condition after recognizing her symptoms. Most poignantly, the specialists detected faint traces of Sarah's handwriting on a paper that appeared to be lying on a table at the edge of the frame. Using extreme magnification and contrast enhancement, they were able to read fragments. "My beloved children, remember that love persists. Death is not an ending but..." These fragments suggested that Sarah had been writing something during or shortly before the ceremony, perhaps final words of comfort for her family, or reflections on the unusual ritual she had orchestrated. 6 months after beginning the restoration project, Margaret organized a public exhibition at the Asheville Heritage Restoration Center. The centerpiece was the Coleridge funeral photograph, now beautifully preserved and mounted, accompanied by extensive documentation explaining its unique history. The exhibition included Reverend Mitchell's journal entries, the letters Sarah had written to her children, census records and land deeds establishing the family's presence in Sourwood Creek, newspaper articles about Sarah's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of the truth about her death, and genealogical information tracing the descendants of the Coleridge children. Margaret also included contemporary psychological research about anticipatory grief and modern hospice practices, drawing explicit connections between Sarah's instinctive approach in 1893 and current best practices in end-of-life care. Several hospice professionals attended the exhibition opening and expressed amazement that concepts they considered modern had been independently developed by a woman with no medical or psychological training over a century earlier. The exhibition drew significant attention. Local news outlets covered the story, and several national publications picked it up. A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in creating a short film about Sarah Coleridge and her living funeral. Descendants of the family, many of whom had never met before, came together at the exhibition to share stories and connect across generational divides. Jennifer Hartford stood before the photograph for a long time during the opening reception, studying the face of her great-great-grandmother. "She looks so strong," Jennifer said quietly to Margaret. "Even knowing she was dying, even arranging her own funeral, she looks determined and dignified." "She was both those things," Margaret confirmed. "But I think what strikes me most is her compassion. Everything she did in those final weeks was motivated by love for her family and a desire to protect them from additional trauma. That kind of selfless courage is rare in any era." The mystery of the empty coffin had been solved, but its significance only grew with understanding. What had appeared to be an inexplicable oddity proved to be a profound statement about human resilience, maternal love, and the universal struggle to maintain dignity and control in the face of death. Margaret prepared a scholarly article about the photograph and the story behind it for publication in a journal of historical preservation. In her conclusion, she wrote, "The Coleridge funeral photograph represents far more than a historical curiosity. It documents a moment when one woman, facing certain death, chose to transform her final act into a gift for her surviving family." Sarah Coleridge understood that memory is selective and powerful, that the images we carry of our loved ones shape our grief and our healing. By arranging for a living funeral, she ensured that her children's last coherent memory of their mother would be of her strength and love rather than of her suffering and death. In an era that often treated death as something to be hidden and avoided in polite conversation, Sarah brought it directly into view and made it serve her family's emotional needs. The empty coffin in the photograph is not a void but a statement, a visual representation of presence in the face of impending absence, agency in circumstances that stripped away almost all control, and love that persisted beyond the boundaries of life itself. Modern viewers often find this photograph unsettling because they understand neither its context nor its purpose. But once the story is known, the image transforms from mysterious to moving, from strange to profoundly human. The 7 people standing around that empty coffin were participating in an act of collective courage, facing their shared future without the person who had been their center. Sarah Coleridge died on October 7, 1893, and was buried quietly in a small cemetery on her family's property. But she lives on in this photograph, frozen in a moment of extraordinary strength, teaching us across the gulf of 130 years that even in our darkest moments, we have choices about how we face the inevitable, how we protect those we love, and how we shape the memories that will outlast our physical presence. The exhibition ran for 3 months and was visited by thousands of people. Many visitors left comments in a guest book, sharing their own experiences with terminal illness, grief, and the challenges of saying goodbye to loved ones. Some wrote about how Sarah's story had given them ideas for their own end-of-life planning. Others simply expressed admiration for her courage. One entry, written in shaky handwriting by an elderly visitor, particularly moved Margaret. "My wife is dying of cancer. We've been struggling with how to help our grandchildren prepare for her passing. After seeing this exhibition and learning about Sarah Coleridge, we've decided to hold a similar ceremony. A chance for the whole family to say goodbye while my wife can still participate and respond. Thank you for sharing this story. It's given us a path forward through an impossible situation." Margaret kept that comment card in her desk drawer, pulling it out whenever she needed a reminder of why historical preservation mattered. The past wasn't just a collection of dates and artifacts. It was a repository of human wisdom, experience, and innovation, lessons that remained relevant across centuries and could still guide people through their darkest moments. As autumn turned to winter and the exhibition prepared to close, Margaret stood alone in the gallery one evening after hours, studying the photograph one last time before it would be carefully packed away for archival storage. Sarah Coleridge looked back at her across 130 years, her face serene and determined. Around her stood her family, each person dealing with their own mixture of grief and strength. The empty coffin remained at the center of the composition, a powerful symbol of both loss and love. Margaret thought about all the puzzles she had solved over her career, the identities of unknown subjects in photographs, the circumstances surrounding damaged artifacts, the stories hidden in layers of accumulated grime and oxidation. But this case would remain special, not because of the mystery itself, but because of what the solution revealed about human nature at its finest. In the face of death, which stripped away almost all control and agency, Sarah Coleridge had found a way to maintain both. She had transformed her dying into an act of service to her family, her funeral into a gift rather than a burden. The empty coffin wasn't a void but a promise, that love persists beyond physical presence, that memory can be shaped by intention, and that even in our most vulnerable moments, we have the power to choose how we face the darkness. The photograph would be preserved, studied, and shared with future generations. But more importantly, Sarah's story would continue, carried forward by everyone who learned about the woman who attended her own funeral and taught her family, and eventually, the world, that dignity and love could transform even death itself into something bearable, even meaningful. As Margaret turned off the gallery lights and locked the door behind her, she felt grateful for her profession and for the chance it had given her to uncover this remarkable story. The past held countless such stories, waiting to be discovered and understood. Each one added depth and richness to our understanding of human experience, connecting us across time to people whose lives seemed distant but whose emotions and struggles remained eternally familiar. Sarah Coleridge had been dead for 130 years, but her courage lived on in the photograph, in the memories of her descendants, and in the hearts of everyone who learned her story. The empty coffin had given up its secret, revealing not darkness but light, the light of one woman's extraordinary love for her family and her determination to protect them even from beyond the grave. And in that revelation, the mystery had become something far more valuable than mere curiosity satisfied. It had become inspiration, wisdom, and a reminder that even in our darkest hours, we have more power than we realize to shape our legacies and protect those we love.